The Imperial Vanguard assault cruiser touched down dead center in the North American Everglades on a muggy August afternoon. Commander Frax stepped down the boarding ramp in his multi-layered climate-controlled carapace, fully expecting to read the Galactic Empire's decree of conquest to a crowd of shivering carbon-based lifeforms. Instead of cowering pleas for mercy, his audio receptors were blasted by the deafening roar of a V8 engine strapped to a flat-bottom airboat. The bow tore through the muddy sawgrass, piloted by a shirtless human male rocking mirrored aviators, steering with one hand while cracking open a cheap can of Budweiser with the other. The man, named Chuck, whipped the airboat into a tight drift, parking it right at the spaceship's boarding gate. No screaming. No running away. He just snatched up a heavy, grease-stained pipe wrench, pointed it at Frax's multi-million credit warship and hollered over the engine's roar. "Buddy, you parked this piece of tin right over my best gator spot, and I guarantee y'all ain't got a permit from Fish and Wildlife." Before Frax could even initialize his translator matrix, the water erupted. A 12-foot Florida gator violently breached the surface, its jaws clamping dead, shut onto the glowing plasma rifle in the alien commander's hands. The gator's immense bite force instantly crushed the plasma rifle's energy tube. What followed was a textbook death roll. Pale blue high-energy coolant mixed with swamp muck sprayed all over Frax's faceplate. In the blink of an eye, an Imperial Standard issue weapon, worth the entire annual GDP of a small developed Earth nation, was ripped into scrap metal and dragged into the murky depths. Frax's sensors instantly bottlenecked into a screen of static. He had lived for 3 centuries, conquered 17 habitable worlds, and witnessed both nuclear baptisms and orbital bombardments. Never once had he seen a wild reptile chew up elite Imperial weaponry like gummy bears. Before his stiffening climate-controlled suit could even prime its wrist-mounted defense cannons, the sweltering heat of Florida punched right through the crack in his faceplate. His internal coolant instantly spiked to the red line, bubbling in flash, boiling in the damp air. Chuck muttered a curse. The half-can of Bud he had just cracked open was completely ruined by the flying mud. His temples throbbed at the tragic loss of good beer. Planting his boots on the rocking deck, the Florida man closed the gap to the stunned alien commander in 2 strides. He swung that grease and gator blood-stained pipe wrench like a baseball bat, bringing it down on Frax's 10 million credit helmet with everything he had. The crisp crack of the impact sent shorebirds scattering in a panic. The Imperial ceramic faceplate, rated to withstand meteorite impacts at 1 kilometer per second, shattered into shards like a discount glass soda bottle. Frax's milky eyes were exposed to the damp, sweltering air. Before he could even ping an SOS, Chuck ripped the tactical comms pad right off the alien's waist, clipping it casually to the belt of his faded blue jeans. Frax dropped like a lead weight, slamming heavily into the waist, deep muck with a dull thud. Right behind him, the heavy alloy doors of the Vanguard cruiser began to groan with the low growl of hydraulic motors. Deep red warning lights bled through the widening gap as the freezing metal doors slowly slid apart. The ear-piercing screech of grinding metal made Chuck's teeth ache. The moment the hatch cleared, 6 Imperial stormtroopers decked out in silver-white carapace armor charged out, plasma rifles raised. Crimson high energy beams instantly swept toward where Chuck was standing. The leading 3 plasma bolts grazed Chuck's shirt and buried themselves into the bubbling layer of rot on the riverbank. Highly concentrated swamp gas, baking for the better part of a month, ignited into a towering fireball. The chain reaction ripped through the marsh, tossing the entire layer of black water into the sky. A filthy rain of rotten grass and mud slammed face, first into the freshly deployed stormtroopers. The precision cooling vents on their armor were instantly choked with muck. Onboard sensors shrieked with overload warnings, and their textbook tactical formation immediately fell apart. The aliens slipped and slid backward in the sludge. Their pride and joy, the energy shields, couldn't stop a handful of dirt. The low-velocity, purely physical kinetic mass of the mud punched right through the energy barriers, pasting itself thick over their optical visors. Crystal, clear combat telemetry degraded into pure static. Scalding coolant started leaking from the seams of their silver armor, and the 98% humidity caused every high-tech piece of gear to throw fatal error codes. Chuck spat out a mouthful of grass and saliva. He vaulted back onto his tethered airboat in a few quick strides and snatched the AR-15 leaning against the gunwale, firing blind through the shower of black mud to lay down suppressing fire. The lead slugs completely ignored the energy shields, thudding hard into the leg armor of 3 troopers. They howled, collapsing into the waste, deep sludge. Catching a glimpse of his beer cooler, blasted open by a plasma beam and leaking half a dozen frosty cans into the swamp, Chuck's eye twitched. "Y'all are paying for my damn beer," he roared, slamming his hand onto the ignition of the modified V8. The engine roar swallowed the sound of the explosions. The propeller aggressively churned the mud, and the flat-bottomed boat violently lurched forward, hauling ass toward the mangroves. The wall of mud kicked up by the swamp. Gas explosions perfectly screened his exit, eating the alien's second volley entirely. Chuck grabbed the rudder, nudged his mirrored shades back up his nose, and slammed the throttle wide open. The rigged V8 belched thick black smoke, carving a path right through the dense mangrove trunks and vanishing into the labyrinth of waterways. The hull had barely scraped past a massive tree trunk into the shadows when the hairs on the back of Chuck's neck stood on end. Dropping beneath the cloud cover was the distinct incoming whine of repulsor lift engines cutting through the air. Chuck aggressively shoved the rudder. The V8 roared its raspy growl, and the aluminum hull whipped hard in the narrow channel, kicking up a 7-foot wave of yellow-brown water and sliding dangerously close to the tangled mangrove roots. An Imperial scout on a silver-gray hoverbike clipped the canopy on his way down, shredding a storm of dew-soaked leaves. A cold red targeting laser clicked dead onto Chuck's back. The plasma rifle's energy tubes were already glowing red, hot with the pre-charge. The narrow channel meant the alien couldn't flank him. He had to stay low and ride Chuck's tail. Chuck reached back blindly to the surviving cooler on the stern. His fingers brushed against 2 frost-covered cans. As he snatched them, he whipped his arm around, violently shaking the cans in the air. The aluminum deformed slightly under his grip as the internal pressure spiked, pushing the walls of the cans taut. When the hoverbike closed to within 30 yards, its intake grill perfectly aligned with the back of the boat, Chuck pivoted his hips, cranked his core, and hurled the 2 heavily pressurized beers like a pair of cheap grenades. The first can glanced off the scout's visor. The second sailed flawlessly into the hoverbike's ventral air intake, wedging itself right into the high-speed turbine blade. The smooth hum of the engine violently ceased, followed instantly by a piercing overload squeal. The highly sensitive alien sensors got drenched in carbonated, ice-cold beer and short-circuited into a shower of blue sparks. The crushed aluminum can shredded the turbine blades, and the shrapnel punched straight through the energy core. Brilliant blue flames erupted from the bike's chassis. The Imperial scout froze in the saddle, his suit venting massive clouds of white steam from the short circuit. He had seen high-energy plasma firefights, and he had seen antimatter missile barrages. But never in his life had he seen an enemy launch a tactical strike using canned beer. The shock was so total he forgot to hit the eject button. Chuck wiped the mud splatter off his face and spat. "Sumbitch. Owe me 2 cold ones. Good stuff, too. Been on ice all afternoon." Trailing, billowing black smoke, the hoverbike flipped end over end and slammed into the muddy shallows. The metal frame snapped in half, driving the cockpit crooked into the muck where it hissed blue smoke. Chuck kicked the boat into idle, slung the AR-15 over his shoulder, and reached for the mooring rope. He yanked it tight, tying off the rocking boat at the edge of the shoal. Murky swamp water flooded over the ankles of his rubber boots, sludge seeping in through the cracks. Muttering another curse, he stomped over aluminum scrap and burning alien plastic toward the wreck. The explosive decompression of the beer cans had done a number on the rig. Half the chassis was buried in the mud, sizzling and leaking glowing coolant. Chuck kicked aside the broken body of the Scout hanging out of the wreck. His fingers brushed against the cold alien armor before stopping. He hooked a volleyball-sized heavy iron lump with a tactical ring attached to it. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the heft pull at his wrist, and clicked his tongue. No wonder these bastards kept this strapped to their lower back. Got some real kick to it. He hoisted the high-yield gravity mine over his shoulder. As he turned, a wet sloshing sound came from the mud behind him. The half-buried Imperial Scout wasn't dead yet. His short, circuiting suit was smoking as he shakily raised a cracked plasma pistol, aiming right at Chuck's back. Chuck didn't even look over his shoulder. He smoothly dropped the AR-15 to his hip and pulled the trigger. The solid slug tore straight through the Scout's helmet. The alien didn't even have time to pop a shield. The mud had blinded their sensors so badly they couldn't even lock on, much less deflect raw kinetic energy. Chuck lashed the mine tight to the empty space on the bow of the boat, spun the rudder, and headed half a mile out to a poacher's hidden diesel stash. Last month, the poacher had messed with a 16-footer and ended up as gator chow, leaving half a barrel of cheap diesel buried in the roots. Chuck popped the bung and started pouring the foul, muddy, moss-laced fuel straight into the airboat's tank. The overflow slicked the surface of the water, instantly drawing a frenzy of piranhas to nip at the boat's paint. Chuck kicked the side of the hull, muttering, "Hold your damn horses, plenty to go around," before booting the empty barrel into the water to feed the fish. He wiped the grease off his hands, leaned back against the beer cooler, and pulled out the last untouched cold one. Right as his finger hooked under the tab, a line of silver dots started pushing silently through the muggy gray fog to the north. The hum of wings slicing through the humid air drifted into Chuck's ears. A squad of Imperial terraforming drones broke through the gray-green mist, hovering low over the mangrove canopy. Circular vents on their bellies slowly dilated. A pale yellow-green nerve gas poured out, drifting like a toxic cloud toward Chuck's boat. Chuck swore, reaching behind his waist to grab a gas mask, head swiped from the poacher's stash. He snapped the buckles tight and ducked low behind the roaring V8 engine block. The cheap, dirty diesel wasn't burning clean. Heavy, dark gray exhaust plumed up from the block, slowly drifting into the incoming toxic cloud. A bizarre chemical reaction kicked off instantly. The moment the alien gas touched the oily, soot-heavy diesel exhaust, it rapidly coagulated into thick, powdery gray clumps. The toxic dust rained harmlessly into the hot, muddy water, failing to drift even a few feet. The drone's onboard sensors blinked frantically with red warnings, registering high toxicity levels at the source, but failing to compute that the payload was dropping straight into the mud. They just kept spraying at max capacity. Less than 10 minutes later, the vents closed. Hearing nothing, Chuck pulled off the mask, shook his head, and took a deep breath. Just the smell of dirt and diesel, not a single throat, burning tickle. He looked down at his boots. The icy beer head dropped was sitting in the mud, half-coated in grime. He picked it up, wiped it off, popped the tab, and took a massive pull, throwing a middle finger up at the hovering drones. "Appreciate it. Cleared the skeeters out for free. Bring more next time." The drones' logic circuits completely overloaded. They wobbled in the air before collectively doing a 180 and buzzing south. Chuck narrowed his eyes into the fog. Deep in the gray mist, a dozen massive Imperial gunships were advancing in formation. Their trajectory was locked dead onto the trailer park, 3 miles out. Tonight was the weekly BBQ blowout, and every old drunk in the park was waiting on ice, cold beer, and baby back ribs. Chuck shoved the half-empty can into a waterproof pouch, locked the AR-15 into his shoulder, and grabbed the ignition key. The V8 whined as the pre-heat kicked in, the prop gently stirring the black rot in the shallows. He spun the bow south, pointing it right at the string lights glowing through the tree line. The humid wind, reeking of swamp weed and methane, slapped him in the face. In 30 seconds he blew out of the mangrove narrows, the wooden fence of the trailer park coming into view. Fat Joe was squatting by the charcoal pit, flipping ribs. A cooler sat nearby with half a dozen beers on ice. 3 or 4 retirees were huddled around a folding table playing poker, with string lights swaying in the oak branches above. Nobody had noticed the silver shadows drifting in over the horizon. Chuck started screaming from 50 yards out, his voice rasping like sandpaper on sheet metal. "Get off your asses. We got Imperial fleet bastards coming to slaughter the yard. Grab your gear." Embers splashed into Joe's face. He started cursing, about to ask if Chuck had been hitting the bootleg whiskey again, when Chuck slammed the airboat hard into the muddy bank. The hull smashed against the wooden fence, snapping beams. Chuck kicked the anchor loose, jumped ashore, and instantly dragged something out of his boat, a portable generator head jacked from the poacher's spot. It was flaking rust and crusted with dried gator shit. The trailer park had gotten its public siren cut off last week, over 3 months of unpaid power bills, but the main wiring block was still sitting nicely under the hornbox. Chuck leaned his AR-15 against the fence. The half-can of beer at his waist dug into his side. With mud-slicked hands, he grabbed the thick cables, stripped the insulation in 2 quick yanks, and jammed them into the terminal. Grabbing the pull cord, he ripped it back. The first pull failed, but on the second, a cloud of blue-gray diesel smoke blasted out. The generator bucked and sputtered like a horny wild boar before finally turning over. Chuck threw the main breaker on the siren. The deafening wail shook the oak leaves loose, entirely drowning out the croaking of the swamp frogs. He rubbed his ringing ears and squinted at the northern horizon. The silver silhouettes of the Imperial heavy gunships had already crested the reeds. The low-frequency rumble of their engines vibrated through the soles of his boots, making the glowing coals in the BBQ pit dance. Right on cue, one by one, the doors of the RVs and mobile homes started throwing wide open. Rusty door frames banged against siding as a small army of shirtless, baseball cap, wearing Florida boys poured out. There were gator hunters racking 12-gauge shotguns, mechanics wielding 3-foot lug wrenches, and an old widow hauling a V8, powered modified ballista. Every pair of eyes was burning with pure malice. The muggy air clung to their skin like lard. The generator-powered siren kept screaming, flushing every waterbird out of the mangroves until they blotted out half the overcast sky. Chuck leaned against the dented front bumper of his truck, resting the AR-15 on the push bar. He pulled out the tactical comms pad head looted earlier, weighed it in his hand, and tossed it to his grease-stained neighbor, Old Joe. The man had torn down more V8 engines in his life than the aliens had seen swamp mosquitoes. "Figure this thing out. Jam their local targeting radar," Chuck ordered. He wiped the sweat off his chin, cracked his icy beer, and took a deep pull. The malt chased the swamp gas straight up into his sinuses. He narrowed his eyes at the approaching fleet. The flawless silver armor plating was already sweating heavily in the damp air. The alien climate control systems were thoroughly losing the war against the weather. The buzz of struggling sensors could be heard blocks away, and their view screens were strobing like busted cathode ray TVs. Old Joe grumbled, poking at the shiny alien interface with grease-caked fingers for a solid 3 minutes before letting out a bellowing laugh. "Fucking galactic nerds. The admin password on this piece of shit is literally 12 zeros. He slammed his palm down on the lock command, the impact making the gravel jump. Got him. Locked out. These dumbasses couldn't find their own left foot in a boot right now. The gunship formation immediately broke into chaos, drifting left and right like headless flies. Low-frequency tremors began to shake the ground, rippling the swamp water. A massive patch of mangroves crashed down as the cold silver shine of heavy infantry plating pushed through the brush. The encirclement was closing in on the trailer park inch by inch, and the chests of the alien soldiers were already glowing with the pale gray light of mind control wave emitters. The invisible psionic wave swept over the rusted chain link fence. 3 rednecks ducking behind an RV instantly went limp. Their shotguns clattered to the dirt, their eyes rolling back into solid white. Chuck was just bringing his beer up for a sip. The wave hit, causing his wrist to jerk, spilling a quarter of his cold beer directly onto the hood of his '98 Ford F-150. He stared at the bubbling puddle of foam. The vein in his temple twitched 3 times. Motherfucker. Don't mess with a man's beer, he hissed. He yanked open the tailgate of the pickup and wrestled out a massive concert amp head scavenged from a strip club junkyard last month. Grunting, he dragged it over to the generator. Joe had finished the hack, leaving an outlet free. Chuck taped up the frayed cord with 3 wraps of electrical tape, jammed it in, and cranked the volume dial so hard the plastic knob snapped off and rolled into the mud. He slammed the power switch. A thumb drive loaded with Florida death metal blasted through the speakers at 120 decibels. The air physically warped with the shockwave. Every RV window in the park, spiderwebbed and shattered in a single second. Bicycles parked on the grass bounced down the slopes into the puddles. The mosquitoes in the mangroves were pulverized by the sound, raining down like black pepper. The muggy wind churned aggressively, and even the distant water rippled with violent cymatic patterns. The Imperial Heavy Infantry's mind control worked on delicate precision, tuned low-frequency resonance. It stood exactly 0 chance against raw, chaotic, overpowered acoustic violence. The pale gray emitters on their chests freaked out, spitting showers of electrical sparks. Their cranial sensors, already half, drowned in the 98% humidity, were hammered so hard their skulls literally rattled. The troopers stumbled around, clutching their helmets, while their servo motors screamed in protest, locking them completely rigid in the mud. Chuck wiped the shattered glass off his face and reached into the truck bed for a pump-action shotgun loaded with heavy buckshot. His fingers hit the cold walnut stock. He pulled it close, thumbing off the safety. He racked the slide. Clack, clack. The chambering of the shell echoing with a heavy, satisfying thud that cut cleanly through the static buzz of the death metal amp. The dozen heavy infantrymen in the Vanguard had lost all cohesion. They were staggering aimlessly in the muck, high-pitched shrieks bleeding out of their comms. Their precision cooling suits were massively overtaxing, leaking sweet, smelling coolant everywhere. They couldn't even aim their rifles. Chewing on a mud-flecked cigarette butt, Chuck charged straight into the ankle, deep sludge, kicking black spray onto his own back. The first trooper, just 3 steps away, clumsily swung his cannon around. Chuck pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge buckshot slammed directly into the knee joint seam. The armor there, machined paper, thin so it wouldn't interfere with the energy shield, instantly blew into shrapnel. Teal coolant sprayed Chuck right in the face as the trooper dropped hard to his knees. A second alien tried to wobble back and fire. Chuck slid under the wild plasma shot, racking and firing directly into its ankle joint. The prosthetic snapped like a twig, sending the trooper crashing into a sapling. The third tried to retreat, but got his boots completely suctioned by the mud. Chuck stepped up and blew his thigh joint to hell. The alien collapsed into a helpless target in the slime. Chuck slung the shotgun over his back, pulled the pipe wrench from his belt, and shoved it into the armor gaps. He wedged it against the personal shield generator mounts, strained his arm, and with a loud crack, popped the clips loose. Ripping the wiring out, he quickly clipped 3 heavy military-grade alien shield generators to his own tactical belt. The remaining Imperial infantry were rolling in the mud, clutching their heads. Some fired blindly, blowing pine trees in half and raining debris everywhere. Chuck wiped the mix of black mud and coolant off his face, crushed his cigarette into the dirt, and glanced west. The last sliver of blood, orange sun, was slipping below the horizon. The muggy swamp wind finally cooled off, and the ink-black night pressed down onto the trailer park. Faintly drifting on the air came the high-pitched sound of a hum. The hum grew denser, multiplying into a deafening roar that swept across the marshes. Billions of giant Florida swamp mosquitoes were swarming out for the night. A black cloud rolled over the water, tracking the scent directly toward the staggering Imperial soldiers. The alien climate suits had popped their seals in the heat. The sweet, pale blue coolant leaking from their joints was basically a neon VIP invite to an all-you-can-eat buffet. The panicked aliens flared their energy shields. But while the shields stopped lasers and plasma, they did absolutely nothing against low-velocity bugs. The massive, thumb-sized mosquitoes squeezed right through the force fields, swarming into exhaust vents, visor cracks, and armor joints, completely maddened by the sugar, sweet coolant. In less than 30 seconds, the rigid Imperial Vanguard was completely broken. They screamed, flailing their plasma rifles wildly, smacking their own faces and necks. Pale green alien blood leaked from their cracked carapaces, their exposed skin blowing up in massive red welts. Every breath became a bloody cough. Chuck leaned back against a mangrove trunk, tapped the activator, and popped 3 overlapping blue force fields. The translucent dome perfectly shielded him and the beer cooler buried in the grass. He cracked another frosty can, the icy foam spraying with the smell of hops. He took a huge gulp, raised an eyebrow at the flailing aliens, and muttered, "Ain't karma a bitch?" The wildly firing aliens kicked up dirt. Driven completely insane by the bites, they held their triggers down. Blinding purple-blue plasma bolts ricocheted everywhere. One stray bolt grazed a branch, trailing a glowing tail, and shot straight toward the trailer park's communal beer storage shed. The blast blew the rusted corrugated iron walls wide open. A white wave of dry ice and malt scent rushed out. Entire kegs rolled down the dirt embankment. Glass bottles exploded into dust. Amber liquid cascaded into the drainage ditch, washing right over Chuck's mud-caked boots. Chuck was leaning against the tree, shielded from the chaos, casually watching the Imperial troops get eaten alive like total idiots poking a hornet's nest. He was enjoying the show, sipping his beer, completely relaxed. But as the beer flooded his boots and the smell of wasted alcohol hit his nose, the smirk on his face froze completely solid. Jimmy the mechanic poked his head out from behind an RV, his voice cracking. "Chuck, that was our ice stock for the whole quarter. Old Tom's 12-year bourbon was in there. It's all gone." Chuck slammed his half-empty beer down onto the stump, so hard the glass bottom buried an inch into the wood. A raspy, smoke-filled growl tore out of his throat. Motherfucking space trash. He ripped the tarp off the bed of his truck. The high-yield gravity minehead pulled from the hoverbike was sitting right there, nestled between a spare tire and a spool of fishing line, its dark casing still painted in swamp mud. He bent down, hoisted the massive bomb onto his broad shoulders, letting the weight dig in without making a single sound. Stomping through the puddle of beer foam and dirt, he closed the distance to his rusted Ford F-250 Super Duty. Up on the hill, the locals were laying into the completely demoralized Imperial infantry. Buckshot sparked furiously against the remaining shields. The black clouds of mosquitoes followed the gunfire, swiping any stragglers, their horrific screams piercing right through the energy barriers. Holding the heavy mine with one hand, Chuck yanked open the driver's side door. He scraped the mud off his boots on the running board, slid into the cab reeking of tobacco and stale beer, and locked his eyes dead on the massive, glowing gray landing gear of the alien flagship, parked a mile out. His right hand reached under the passenger seat for a thick coil of half-inch steel gator, snaring cable. The wire was still crusted with dried blood and mud from a 10-footer he dragged last month, but he didn't blink as it scratched his knuckles. He hauled the heavy gravity mine to the front grille, jammed it tight between the steel brush guard tubes, and wrapped it repeatedly with the heavy wire. Veins popped in his left arm as he pulled it taut, finally clamping the lock shut with his own teeth. He clamped it so hard the alien alloy actually dented. "Some bitches blew up the damn beer," Chuck spat, hawking a wad of tobacco juice out the window. He rigged his stolen portable shield generator to the inside of the windshield, perfectly positioned to deflect frontal fire. The trailer park erupted in a new wave of gunfire. Jimmy screamed into a megaphone, his voice breaking. Radars jammed. Their main cannons can't turn. Give 'em hell, Chuck. Dozens of rednecks mounted RV roofs and tailgates, pouring endless magazines of buckshot and AR rounds into the flagship's perimeter. The frantic returning plasma fire shredded the mud, but whenever a beam hit Chuck's windshield, the blue force field deflected it harmlessly into the cattails, setting the brush on fire. Chuck slid into the driver's seat and aggressively cranked the ignition. The V8 roared, blasting out a thick cloud of foul diesel smoke. The tires spun out for a fraction of a second before finding hard traction. The heavy pickup launched forward like a lead slug. The wind blew his cowboy hat clean into the bed. Chuck pinned the pedals straight to the floor mat, his eyes locked on the weak spot he had zeroed in on, the exposed joint on the flagship's right landing strut. The distance closed in a flash. The roaring truck plowed right through two panicked stormtroopers, trying to block the path, sending them flying into a ditch without him even blinking. The massive gravity mine on the bumper was now less than 2 feet from the flagship's cold hull. The violent shudder of the tires ripping through mud shot up his spine. Chuck let go of the steering wheel, pulled his hunting knife from his boot, and slashed the steel cable holding his door shut. The wire snapped, whipping against the panel and leaving a deep gouge. Chuck threw his weight, tucked and barrel rolled straight out of the cab, crashing heavily into a waist, deep mud pit, snatching his half-empty beer off the passenger seat mid-air. The uncrewed F-250 carried its massive momentum directly into the root joint of the flagship's right landing strut. The fuse buzzed for half a second before the immense gravitational field detonated. The spotlights on the flagship violently flickered. Before the shocked screams of the bridge crew could even broadcast, the 2-foot-thick composite armor buckled inward like crushed aluminum foil. The hydraulic lines in the leg violently ruptured, spraying sweet coolant into the methane-rich swamp. The gigantic hull lurched. The structural support, supposed to be anchored to bedrock, crumpled instantly, driving the stump of the leg straight down into the deep mud. Chaos erupted inside the flagship. Blaring red klaxons tore through the night. Panicked Marines fired blindly, turning the mangroves into toothpicks. The giant mosquitoes, previously lured by the coolant, were driven into a frenzy by the heat of the lasers, swarming the terrified soldiers until they dropped their weapons. The massive flagship began to list heavily toward its broken leg, rapidly picking up speed. Its belly crushed the canopy of the swamp oaks, snapping trunks like twigs. The immense weight compacted the swamp floor, forcing massive methane bubbles to the surface, followed by sulfur-scented geysers erupting into the sky. Chuck leaned against a tree in the ditch, wiped the grime off his face, took a swig of beer, and watched the Colossus slowly sink into the swamp abyss to the sound of popping rivets and tearing steel. The main airlock, warped by the hull's tilt, ground open with an agonizing screech of metal, cracking just 1.5 feet wide. Cold interior lights bled into the night, casting a long shadow that dragged itself toward the threshold. The massive figure finally reached the gap, Commander Frax. His once pristine silver armor was completely caked in brown muck, aggressively venting steam. His internals were so fried by the damp gas he could barely walk. Tumbling out of the door, he desperately clutched a self-destruct trigger wired into his gauntlet, his trembling fingers inching toward the button. Chuck groaned, jammed his beer into a nook in the tree stump, and baseball slid down the muddy bank. Frax tried to prime his wrist plasma, but the busted cooling system misfired, blowing a shower of sparks into his own arm and sending him crashing against a solid mangrove stump. Before the alien could recover, Chuck was on him. He pinned Frax's wrist with one hand, and with the other he reached into his cargo pocket and whipped out a brand new roll of heavy-duty duct tape. It was one of the 3 holy items he never left home without. Chuck violently wrapped the industrial tape around the stump and the alien's wrist, pulling it so tight the armor actually deformed. The muddy adhesive fused the high-tech gauntlet to the dead wood. Frax struggled, but it didn't budge an inch. The overload alarms were blaring so loud, they flushed the last of the herons out of the reeds. Frax choked out garbled alien curses. Coolant leaked from the tape seams, its sugary scent instantly calling the nearby swarm of mosquitoes. Chuck bit off the end of the duct tape, wiped the mud off his face, and glanced at the self-destruct button on the gauntlet. He spat out a piece of adhesive, slowly raised his filthy hand, and reached for his belt. He drew his 18-inch heavy pipe wrench, a dried piece of gator meat still stuck in the teeth. Bound entirely by duct tape, the Imperial commander hissed, bleeding coolant. The muggy air had completely cooked his sensors. Straining his eyes, he forced his vocalizer to spit out a staticky translation, barbarian. The self-destruct is primed. This entire swamp will be vaporized. Chuck tilted his head and took a swig of the warm beer. He let out a burp that smelled like hops and swamp gas, then tapped the heavy steel head of the wrench against his hand. Yeah? Good. That stump's been in the way of my catfish nets for years. Saves me the trouble of chopping it. Before Frax could process that, the wrench came whistling down, lodging directly into the crack in his visor. The commander's optical sensors blew out in a blast of static. His body twitched once, and he went limp as a caught catfish, completely unconscious. Chuck yanked at the duct tape, decided it was too much work, and just snapped the roots of the stump entirely. He slung the 180-pound alien over his shoulder and slogged back toward the airboat, his boots squelching. Out on the water, the rest of the Imperial fleet was dead. The humidity had fried everything. The shields popped and died, and the ships nosedived into the mud one after another, throwing massive waves of sludge. The trailer park crew was already storming the wrecks with lug wrenches, hacksaws, and garbage bags. Voices echoed over the water. Chuck, you reckon this space metal is thick enough to weld a new smoker? I called dibs on the glowing lights for my porch. Chuck tossed the unconscious Frax into the bottom of the airboat like a sack of potatoes, kicked him against the gunwale, and tied him down. As he reached for his beer, something glowing caught his eye in the water. It was Frax's tactical comms pad, still on, floating near the hull. A line of universal text flashed across the screen. This is Imperial High Command. Report casualties immediately. What is the civilization tier of the invaders? Chuck clipped the beer to his belt. Gripping his pipe wrench tight, he smirked at the glowing device, lifted his mud-caked boot, and stomped the silver block straight to the bottom of the swamp.
This story is an absolute riot and a masterclass in sci-fi dark comedy. It brilliantly flips the script on the classic alien invasion trope. Instead of a narrative where humanity unites in terror against a technologically superior threat, the Imperial Vanguard lands in the absolute worst possible place on Earth, the Florida Everglades. Their greatest adversary isn't a global military coalition, but a shirtless guy named Chuck who is profoundly offended that they parked over his fishing spot and ruined his ice, cold Budweiser. The brilliance of this piece lies in its extreme juxtaposition. Sterile Tech versus Swamp Grime. We watch multi-million credit energy weapons become chew toys for local gators, and state-of-the-art, climate-controlled armor get utterly defeated by 98% humidity and a swarm of bloodthirsty mosquitoes. Precision versus pure chaos. The author drags the polished aesthetic of traditional sci-fi through the mud, literally. Chuck and his trailer park neighbors fight back not with force fields and lasers, but with duct tape, pipe wrenches, 120 decibel death metal, and purely kinetic, unadulterated redneck ingenuity. It is a hilarious kinetic twist on the humanity. Fuck yeah. HFY genre. The aliens lose because their systems rely on predictable, sterile logic, whereas the Florida man archetype thrives in absolute chaos. The story is absurdly violent, wonderfully paced, and incredibly satisfying. If there is one primary takeaway from this muddy masterpiece, it is this. Never underestimate the destructive capability of a man defending his weekend BBQ, and always carry a roll of heavy-duty duct tape.